Hi, it's Tuesday, November 4th. We've got a couple of systems to discuss in the Western Pacific today. We've got Typhoon Kalmaegi, Philippine named Tino, sitting over the central Philippines today. And the system made landfall in the central Philippines last night as a strong typhoon and is now impacting a lot of these islands with typhoon force winds and will do that through much of the day today. And going into Wednesday, the system will move into the South China Sea, where we'll likely see some re-intensification, and we could see a significant landfall in Vietnam by late week from this storm. And the other system is Invest 90W in the tropical Pacific. This is Guam for reference, and this is a broad area flow pressure sitting south of these islands. And the designation has changed with this. It used to be 99W. It's the same system, though, same disturbance. And this system will likely form later this week and may start to intensify as it tracks towards the northwest. And we may have to watch it in long term for the Philippines and surrounding areas. So we'll talk about that once we get past all the stuff with Kalmaegi. So starting off with that storm here. Again, the system made landfall as a strong typhoon in the central Philippines overnight. Unfortunately, the increasing wind shear was not enough to keep this system from intensifying at a quick pace. And we saw the system reach the ceiling that we talked about yesterday morning, that being a Category 3 equivalent, which is a strong typhoon. And now the system has weakened a little bit because it is interacting with land, but there is still typhoon force winds with it. And for that reason, we still have Signal 3 and Signal 4 warnings across the central Philippines today, and these may be extended even further west as the system gets closer to the west central Philippines, and a broader swath of Signal 1 to Signal 2 warnings. And that's generally the area where we can expect continued tropical storm force winds and heavy rainfall from the system throughout the day today. But going into the day on Wednesday, the system should begin to clear out as it moves to the South China Sea, and we may see the system re-intensify on approach to Vietnam, perhaps to a higher intensity than it got before the Philippines. If we look at the HAFS model, we'll go back to the initialization here, we can see how the upper level pattern will shift in favor of the system's re-intensification. And in this initial view, you can see how the environment got fairly unfavorable for the system. Now, keep in mind, the system's motion is generally towards the west or a little bit north of due west today, and these streamlines indicate wind shear that is out of the northeast, and that is by definition vertical shear, which is the change in wind direction with height. And this is more of a significant impact on the storm, with the magnitude of this overall being around 20 knots. And so even if it was over water by this point, it would likely be getting disrupted fairly significantly by this point. But as we move to the South China Sea, what we'll notice is that the shear vector shifts in the upper lower parts of the atmosphere, and also some of the wind does decrease in magnitude in that upper part of the troposphere. And so you'll see that by this point, which is by Wednesday evening local time, the system is tracking due west, and now the upper lower flow is also generally easterly, aligned with the forward motion of the storm. And if we take a sounding from the HASS model, we'll still see that we have moderate shear values. This has been in a lot of models by this time, in the range of about 10 to 15 knots, but this is much more manageable for a TC than 20 knots of shear, especially with the vertical aspect that we have right now. And so this may leave the system room to intensify even in the face of that moderate shear. And you can see on the HAFS model that the pressure does decrease at a pretty significant rate down to the 940s and 950s, indicating that the system is getting pretty strong on the model by this point. And unfortunately, this seems to persist all the way up to landfall in Vietnam, and we could be looking at a significant landfall here in Vietnam later this week. And this has been a pretty consistent idea on the Google DeepMind ensemble. You can see again, here's that weakening taking place as it interacts with the Philippines today. But then we see it move back over water, and the models have been very consistent on showing this re-intensifying into a Category 3 or a Category 4 equivalent during its stretch over the South China Sea. And I do think the ceiling for the system across the South China Sea is a bit higher than we had set for prior to the Philippines. I'd say right now the ceiling is more high-end Cat 3, maybe Category 4, and that is likely to be very significant here along the central coast of Vietnam. Could bring strong typhoon force winds, significant storm surge, and heavy rainfall, not just to Vietnam, but across much of southeastern Asia. And talking about track, we have gotten a lot more confident on the track forecast. The models have been trending into a consensus, showing landfall here in central Vietnam by later this week. And that is the current forecast here from Pagasa. You can see by getting into Thursday afternoon into Friday morning, we see the system making landfall in that region in central Vietnam. And that's pretty much the consensus. One of the main outliers that we had was the GFS model, which was taking the system further north, but even that has been trending towards the south. So we're most likely to see landfall occur here in central Vietnam. And I'll have more videos on this as it continues tracking towards the west. For now, stay safe in the Philippines as the system comes through. We're not done in the Western Pacific, as we've got another disturbance off to the east in the open tropical Pacific that we'll have to watch for quite a while, at least the next week. And this system has had a destination change, as I mentioned at the beginning. It was Invest 99W previously, but the Joint Typhoon Warning Center has changed it to 90W. It's a bit confusing with the number of changes, but regardless, it's the same disturbance sitting out here in the open tropical Pacific. And so far today, as the sun rises, we can see the disturbance is still pretty disorganized. We've got a broad circulation in here like this, with a lot of the convection on the southeastern and southern sides of it. And now, right now, the system is getting sheared as well. You can see some of this northwesterly flow west of the Mariana Island chain, turning to more southwesterly flow off to the east. And this highlights the southern edge of a trough axis in the upper lower parts of the atmosphere, which is sitting to the north of the disturbance, shearing it out of the north. And we can see this very clearly if we look at the Haas model, which I'll go back to initialization of this, and you can see the trough axis sitting here very clearly in this model forecast. Now, over time, this trough is not all too strong, so it will start to weaken throughout time, but also some of the northerly shear that we see here across the Philippine Sea will also begin to decrease, as this northerly flow is a direct result of Typhoon Kalmaegi further west. And as a typhoon there moves further west, this flow will follow it. So what you'll see that as we go in time, this trough decays and that westerly shear also decreases, or northerly shear rather, decreases across the Philippine Sea as 90W tracks towards the northwest. And the progression that we'll see through the system will likely be that we see shears start to decrease later today into tomorrow, and that will result in a gradual wrapping of all this convection onto the north side and all the way around eventually the system's circulation. And we can sort of see this happen if we look at the Haas model relative humidity. It doesn't have it does not have simulated infrared imagery for this basin, but we can get a sense of it if we look at the relative humidity plot here. In which you'll see that as we look at close to initialization, we see that all the deep greens showing where the thunderstorms are still on the south side, with drier colors here indicating a lack of convection on the north side. But as that shear decreases throughout the day, today we see this darker green start to wrap more around and get more coherent around the system center, likely having the system now form into a tropical storm by this point in the model. Now, this may be a little bit too quick. The GFS and the Haas model can sometimes go a little bit too aggressive with disturbances like this, and both of these models agree that the system will be a tropical storm by tonight local time, really. And that seems a little bit fast to me. It probably needs about a day or two more to really consolidate itself and get convection more organized around the center before it actually forms into a tropical storm. And so that's just one thing to take caution of when you're looking at these models that I'm about to show you here with the Haas model and the GFS, which is next. Now, going beyond this point, the forecast for the upper level pattern is forecast to remain generally favorable. You'll see on the GFS that we still have fairly light flow aloft, and this is the same case in the Haas model, showing you a light vertical shear profile with not really much to speak of, and increasing divergence as an upper trough approaches from the north over Japan. And so during this period, once the system forms going into late week, the system may intensify to a significant degree. And we're seeing models like the HAPS, like the GFS, like the Canadian, and even Google DeepMind Ensemble now come up in intensity in this part of the forecast. And it's entirely possible that by, Friday local time or Saturday local time, we have a strong typhoon sitting in the Philippine Sea, or at least close to the Philippine Sea by this point. Now, up to this point, we've talked about how there was two distinct scenarios on the track moving beyond this point. And, one was, does the system recurve out to sea with this trough further to the north? And the other one was, does it just miss this trough and just go towards the west, towards the Philippines? Now, over the past couple of days, unfortunately, the trend has been to take the system more towards the west. And if we look at the GFS 500 millibar flow, we can see why this happens. If we look at the steering pattern out to Wednesday evening or Thursday morning, local time this would be, By this point, the storm is now here southwest of Guam on the forecast, and we've got two areas of high pressure, one over the Philippines and Taiwan, one over the subtropical West Pacific, and we've got a little shortwave trough cutting across southern Japan. Now, the shortwave trough is what's been recurving the storm quickly on some prior model forecasts. However, one thing to note about the shortwave trough is it's moving pretty fast. You'll see that by the start of this loop, which again is by Thursday morning, it's south of southwestern Japan, and then by Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening local time, it's already starting to lift out into the far North Pacific. And this is not a lot of time for this to catch it, but also this ridge is also starting to nose in from the west over Taiwan and the Philippines, and this is starting to catch it on the backside of it and try to force it to the west towards the Philippines. And so we've seen a shift in models like the European, for example, that have now put this going further west, closer to the Philippines in those model forecasts. And the consensus today certainly has this now more turning west towards the Philippines in the long-term forecast. And another thing that backs this up is that if we look at the surface flow, you'll see that as that trough comes through, there's also a surface flow further up north, and there's this frontal boundary that is draping down further southwest. And on the backside of this front, we've got more northeasterly flow. And so as this front gets closer, it starts to push the system back towards the southwest, which puts the system on that westward trajectory that we're seeing in a lot of model guidance today. And so the likely scenario now is that we have the system intensify perhaps significantly going into this weekend, and then we see a gradual bend towards the west. And so now the question is, how strong, if the system does intensify significantly late this week, how strong could it still be when it gets to the northern Philippines or surrounding areas if it does take a bit of a different track than just the Philippines? Well, if we look again at the upper level flow plot from the GFS, we'll see that going in time, the shear may increase with time. We see a marketable increase in easterly flow on the south side of a ridge sitting over southern and eastern China. And this may start to increase some of the speed shear in this part of the basin. If we look at the GFS sounding, you'll see a very similar case to what we have with Kalmaegi right now. So we have light surface flow going against stronger mid to upper level flow. And this may start to tilt the vortex with height, and that may cause the system to start weakening some on the model. Now, part of it depends, how strong is this system? Now, stronger systems can tend to be more resilient to the impacts of speed shear. Hurricane Beryl in the Atlantic of 2024 is an example of this. That system got to a Category 5 hurricane as it entered the Eastern Caribbean in July. And in July, climatologically in the North Atlantic, there's very strong easterly trades. And so that started to shear the system with that speed shear. But because the system got so strong, its inner core was more resilient to that impacts of that shear. And so it took a longer time for it to have a very significant impact on the storm's intensity. And so the storm remained a very strong storm in the face of some increasing speed shear that we had for that storm. And so that may be what we're seeing on models here in the GFS now. The GFS does intensify it a little bit there. A bit skeptical of that, with that increasing shear, but nonetheless remaining a strong typhoon on this model forecast as it gets close to the northern Philippines here. And like I just discussed with the Beryl analog, that may be a realistic scenario just given how strong the system could get in the next few days. But one thing that does depend on is, how strong does the system get over this next weekend? Now, the system will have a very favorable environment, though there can be internal struggles. And a larger system, if it does tend to stay larger like it is now, can tend to struggle to intensify very rapidly compared to smaller systems. Though a larger system as well, I should note, does tend to be more resilient to the impacts of speed shear and vertical shear. So there's a lot of uncertainty still to work out, but there does seem to be a decent potential that we do have a strong typhoon approaching the Philippines by next week. You can see in this forecast from the GFS, this is getting to Sunday afternoon and into Monday local time when it does make its closest approach. There is some differences in timing. Now, one aspect of this is that, similar to what we talked about with Kalmaegi, if the storm is stronger like we see on the GFS, it will tend to be faster because it's feeling more of this faster flow in the mid to upper level parts of the troposphere. Whereas if it's weaker, it may not track west as fast, and so we may delay the landfall time. So there's still a lot of uncertainty to work out, but again, we'll have to watch this very closely for the next few days for potential of a strong typhoon coming into the Philippines or surrounding areas later next week. And if we put all the ensembles here, you'll see the overall track spread. If I can pull all these up here, and you can see we do have a significant track spread still. There is still some potential. I didn't really mention it, but there is still some potential that we do see the system track a little bit further north and still recurve east of land masses to the west. It's not a guaranteed landfall yet from the system, but you can see the consensus is much closer to land here. So this does bear watching very closely for Taiwan, southern Japan, and the Philippines over the next week. I will, of course, have more videos on this as we go in time. But that's all that I've got for both of these systems today. Stay safe in the Philippines again as Kalmaegi comes throughout the day today. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.